For years, my dad, Eric, cultivated an image of strict morality. To outsiders, he was the quintessential family man, active in church, a disciplinarian who demanded respect, and a provider who ensured his family never went without. But those of us who lived under his roof knew a different story. He was the kind of father who expected blind obedience, always quick to remind us that as long as you live under my roof, you'll follow my rules. Those rules, by the way, seemed less about creating a loving family dynamic and more about maintaining control. They were rooted in his rigid interpretation of our faith, a faith that often felt like a weapon in his hands. He'd invoke scripture to end arguments, justify punishments, or dismiss our feelings entirely. The thing is, Eric's principles rarely translated to actions. He demanded respect, but gave little in return. Compassion, patience, or even a simple apology when he was wrong. Those were luxuries Eric didn't believe in. His authority was absolute, and questioning it was as good as heresy. Life could have been unbearable if it weren't for Claire, my stepmother. She married Eric when I was 10, stepping into our lives like a ray of sunshine piercing through heavy clouds. My mom had died when I was 6, and those 4 years without her were a blur of grief and chaos. Claire brought stability to our home, and for the first time in years, a sense of normalcy. Claire didn't just marry Eric. She married into a family with a broken heart. She cooked, cleaned, helped us with homework, and made sure we felt loved in ways my dad never could. She never played favorites, treating my brothers, Mark, Sean, and Ben, and me like we were her own. I remember one night when I was 12, struggling with a math assignment that might as well have been written in another language. Dad had stormed off after yelling at me for not trying hard enough, leaving me in tears at the kitchen table. Claire sat down beside me, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You're not dumb, Nate," she said softly. "You just need a little help." She stayed up with me until midnight, walking me through the problems step by step. By the time I finally understood, she looked more proud than I felt. That was Claire in a nutshell, patient, kind, and fiercely devoted. Eric, on the other hand, loved being the head of the household, but his version of leadership often felt oppressive. He belittled Claire in private, calling her soft or too lenient when she didn't agree with his parenting style. He micromanaged our lives, from what we wore to how we spent our free time. Anything that deviated from his vision of a proper upbringing was swiftly shut down. If I wanted to hang out with friends from school, he demanded to know their parents' names, their faith, and whether they attended church regularly. Once, when I asked for a pair of sneakers everyone else at school had, he scoffed. "You want to look like one of those kids who think they're too good for their own family? Not under my roof." But the worst part wasn't the rules. It was the hypocrisy. Eric loved to talk about family values, about how a man's duty was to his wife and children. Yet he'd snap at Claire for the smallest things, like forgetting to add something to the grocery list, and then turn around and preach about forgiveness during Sunday service. I remember catching him in a blatant contradiction once. He'd punish Sean for staying out past curfew, grounding him for a month. Later that week, Eric stayed out late himself, coming home well past midnight without a word of explanation. When I brought it up, he glared at me. "I'm the father. I don't answer to you." Even as a kid, I could tell something didn't add up. For years, I told myself that this was just how dads were: strict, authoritarian, and emotionally distant. And to some degree, I think my brothers believed the same. We respected Eric because we thought we had to, not because he earned it. But as I got older, I started noticing the inconsistencies more. The way he'd make jokes at Claire's expense during family gatherings, then act like the doting husband in front of our church friends. Or how he'd lecture Mark about saving money, all while buying himself expensive gadgets he didn't need. Still, I never confronted him about it. It felt pointless, like trying to reason with a brick wall. So we all played our roles. Claire, the peacemaker. My brothers and me, the obedient sons. And Eric, the righteous patriarch holding it all together. Looking back, I wonder how long it would have taken for us to see through his facade if Claire hadn't found the receipts. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, I'll just say this. The man Eric pretended to be was nothing more than a lie. And once that lie started unraveling, there was no going back. The first noticeable crack in Eric's carefully constructed facade came when Mark, my eldest brother, approached him for help with a down payment. Mark had just married his high school sweetheart, Dana, and with a baby on the way, they were eager to settle into a home of their own. It seemed natural to ask Eric for assistance. After all, he was the one who constantly preached about family values and supporting one another. Eric's response, however, blindsided all of us. "I can't just hand out money," he said, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. Mark, visibly hurt, Try to reason with him. I'm not asking for a handout, Dad. I'd pay you back every cent. I just need a little help to get started. But Eric was unmoved. You should have planned better, he said with a shrug, turning back to his coffee like the conversation was over. Mark left that day feeling humiliated, but he accepted it because he thought Eric's refusal was about teaching a lesson in responsibility. None of us realized the truth, that Eric wasn't refusing out of principle, but because he was funneling money into a private account to fund his double life. Around the same time, Claire began noticing subtle but troubling changes in Eric's behavior. He was coming home later than usual, claiming he had to stay late at the office or attend out-of-town meetings. At first, Claire believed him. Eric had always been a workaholic, and late nights weren't unusual. But the excuses started piling up. One night after a supposed business trip, Claire noticed that Eric's suitcase looked untouched. His clothes were neatly folded, and his toiletry bag hadn't been opened. When she asked about it, he brushed her off. I barely had time to unpack, he said, not meeting her eyes. Then there were the phone calls. Eric started taking his phone with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, something he'd never done before. He'd lower his voice when speaking, and if Claire happened to walk into the room, he'd hang up abruptly. Claire, being the patient and trusting person she was, didn't jump to conclusions. But when she brought up her concerns, Eric turned the tables on her. I work hard to provide for this family, he snapped one evening after she asked about a late-night call. The least you could do is trust me. But trust wasn't something Eric had earned. It was something Claire had given him out of love, and he was abusing it. Even as the rest of us noticed his growing distance, we chalked it up to stress or age. Eric had always been a man of routines, and we assumed his erratic behavior was just a phase. Looking back, it's clear that none of us wanted to believe he was capable of such a profound betrayal. Mark, still smarting from Eric's refusal to help, decided to handle things on his own. He worked extra hours, took on side gigs, and eventually scraped together enough for a modest home. On the day he signed the papers, he invited us all over to celebrate. Eric didn't show up. He said he had a work thing, Claire explained, her voice tinged with disappointment. Mark tried to shrug it off, but I could see how much it hurt him. Guess I'm still standing on my own 2 feet, he muttered, raising his beer in a mock toast. Eric's absence that day felt like a warning sign, but none of us knew how deep the cracks in his facade would go. At the time, we still believed in the image he had carefully cultivated. We didn't realize that the man we thought we knew had already started unraveling, one lie at a time. We just weren't ready to see it yet. The truth came out 8 months after the first cracks began to show, and when it did, it hit like a bomb. Claire had been cleaning Eric's office, a room she rarely entered. Eric had always been territorial about his space, but with him out on another of his suspiciously timed business trips, she decided it was as good a time as any to tidy up. It started innocently enough, organizing loose papers, stacking folders, but then she found the receipts. At first, they didn't seem out of the ordinary. Eric was a businessman, after all, and work expenses were part of the job. But as she skimmed through them, Claire noticed something strange. There were receipts for expensive dinners at upscale restaurants she'd never been to, charges for jewelry she'd never seen, and hotel stays that didn't align with any trip she'd known about. The more she dug, the more damning the evidence became. In one folder, she found an invoice for a necklace, engraved with the initials LL. It wasn't her necklace, and Claire's certainly wasn't LL. That evening, when Eric walked through the door, Claire was waiting. "You want to explain these?" she said, throwing the receipts on the dining table. Eric glanced at the papers, his face betraying no emotion. "Where did you find those?" "Does it matter?" Claire snapped. "Who's Laura?" For a moment, Eric just stared at her. Then, with a calmness that felt like a slap, he said, "I haven't loved you in years. I'm leaving." Claire froze, the air knocked out of her lungs. She'd expected denial, excuses, maybe even anger. But his cold, matter-of-fact confession shattered her. "You're leaving?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "Yes," Eric said simply, as if discussing the weather. "I've been planning this for a while." It wasn't just the affair that broke Claire. It was the sheer cruelty of his words and the realization that the man she'd loved and devoted herself to had been living a double life. Over the next few days, more details came to light. Eric wasn't just cheating. He'd been secretly funneling money out of their joint accounts to support his affair with Laura, a woman none of us had ever even heard of. The betrayal deepened when Claire shared the news with us. Mark, who was still bitter about Eric's refusal to help with his house, put the pieces together almost immediately. "He refused to help me because he was funding this?" Mark yelled, his voice shaking with rage. Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. He's been hiding money for months. I don't even know how much is gone. Mark didn't waste time. He drove straight to Eric's office, ignoring Claire's pleas to wait. When Eric opened the door, Mark didn't even let him speak. "You refused to help me buy a home for my family because you were funding your affair?" Mark yelled, his fists clenched at his sides. Eric didn't flinch. "I'm entitled to spend my money how I see fit," he said coolly. "Your money?" Mark shot back. "You've been stealing from Mom. From all of us." Eric's expression darkened. "Watch your tone. I'm still your father." "Not anymore," Mark said, his voice low. "You're nothing to me." When Mark told us about the confrontation later, none of us were surprised by Eric's lack of remorse. Over the years, we'd seen glimpses of his selfishness, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't just flawed, he was selfish to his core, and he didn't even try to hide it anymore. Claire, meanwhile, began divorce proceedings almost immediately. She wasn't going to let Eric walk away without consequences, especially not after everything he'd done to her and to us. She hired a lawyer and started gathering evidence, bank statements, receipts, anything that could prove his betrayal. The discovery marked the end of the Eric we thought we knew. For years, he'd hidden behind his facade of morality and righteousness, but now the mask was off. And what we saw underneath was a man who had chosen his own desires over his family, no matter the cost. It was a truth none of us could ignore, and it was only the beginning of the fallout. Eric moved out 2 weeks after Claire confronted him, but not without a final act of selfishness. On his way out the door, he packed more than just his clothes. He emptied their savings account entirely, leaving Claire with barely enough to cover the mortgage. When she discovered what he'd done, she didn't cry or rage. She simply sat at the kitchen table, staring at the balance on her bank app, as though it would change if she willed it hard enough. "We'll figure it out," Mark said, his hand on her shoulder. "We always do." But Eric's betrayal was more than just financial. It was the culmination of years of manipulation, hypocrisy, and emotional neglect. He left not just Claire, but all of us, his sons, his family, to fend for ourselves while he chased his so-called happiness with Laura, the woman he claimed was his true love. Claire wasted no time filing for divorce. With the help of her lawyer, she built a case so airtight even Eric couldn't weasel his way out of it. She gathered every piece of evidence she could. Receipts from his affair, bank statements showing the drained accounts, and even testimony from Mark about how Eric had refused to help him while funneling money into his secret life. "I'm not letting him walk away without consequences," Claire told us one night, her voice steadier than I'd expected. And she meant it. Laura, the so-called love of Eric's life, didn't stick around for long. At first, Eric flaunted their relationship, posting pictures of lavish dinners and weekend getaways on social media, as if to prove he'd made the right choice. But the facade crumbled when Claire's legal team started digging into Eric's finances. It turned out Eric's money wasn't as secure as he'd led Laura to believe. Claire's lawyer froze what little remained in their joint accounts. And when the court ruled in Claire's favor during the divorce proceedings, Eric was left with almost nothing. Laura wasn't stupid. She saw the writing on the wall and bailed before Eric could drag her down with him. According to a mutual acquaintance, she packed her bags one night while Eric was out and left a note on the kitchen counter. It simply read, "I didn't sign up for this." The irony wasn't lost on us. Eric had abandoned his family for a woman who didn't even stick around when things got tough. Things went from bad to worse when Eric's company began auditing his expense reports. Apparently, his habit of using company funds to cover personal expenses had raised some red flags. They uncovered thousands of dollars in fraudulent charges, fancy dinners, hotel stays, and even a luxury spa day for Laura, all billed to the company under the guise of client meetings. The fallout was swift. Eric was forced to resign, effectively ending his career. The man who had once lorded over our family with his holier-than-thou attitude was now jobless, broke, and alone. At first, we heard about his downward spiral through mutual friends and acquaintances. He'd started drinking heavily, spending his nights at dive bars, ranting to anyone who would listen about how Claire and the rest of us had ruined his life. He painted himself as the victim, spinning elaborate stories about how Claire had turned his sons against him and stolen everything he'd worked for. None of it was true, of course, but that didn't stop him from trying to rewrite the narrative. One night, he showed up at Mark's house unannounced, reeking of alcohol and desperation. "You need to understand," he slurred, swaying slightly on the porch. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. Claire was suffocating me. Mark didn't even let him inside." "You didn't leave, Dad. You ran. And now you're blaming everyone else for it." Eric's face twisted with anger, but before he could respond, Mark shut the door in his face. Over the next few months, Eric's presence in our lives dwindled to almost nothing. He'd occasionally send rambling texts or leave drunken voicemails, but none of us responded. Claire, despite everything, refused to badmouth him in front of us. "He's still your father," she'd say, though the bitterness in her voice was impossible to miss. But he wasn't our father anymore? Not really. The man we'd once respected, even if begrudgingly, was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. For the first time in years, we began to see clearly. Eric's downfall wasn't the result of bad luck or circumstances beyond his control. It was the inevitable consequence of his own selfishness. And while he spiraled deeper into despair, we started to rebuild, one piece at a time. Eric didn't disappear quietly after his fall from grace. Instead, he launched a campaign of blame and manipulation, calling and texting us incessantly, trying to rewrite the narrative of his downfall. He refused to accept responsibility for his choices, insisting that everyone else, Claire, us, his former employer, was to blame for his ruined life. The first time he called me after Laura left him, I let it go to voicemail. When I finally listened, his message was a strange mix of bitterness and self-pity. "Nate, it's your dad. I just want to talk. I know Claire's been filling your head with lies, but you're smarter than that. You know the truth. Call me back." I didn't. When he tried again a few days later, I picked up. "What do you want, Dad?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "What do I want?" he repeated, his voice rising. "I want to understand why my own son has turned against me. Claire's poisoned you against me, against your own father. She's turned you into her little soldier." I wanted to laugh. Claire hadn't turned us against him. Eric had done that all on his own. "You're the only one responsible for this mess," I said. "You lied. You cheated. You stole. And now you're trying to play the victim? You don't know the whole story," he snapped. "Claire, she's not as innocent as she looks." "Goodbye, Dad," I said, hanging up before he could continue. Eric didn't stop with me. He reached out to Sean and Ben, trying to guilt-trip them in a meeting with him. Sean told me about one particularly infuriating call. "Family is all we have," Eric had said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "You can't let Claire's lies keep us apart." "I'm your father. You're the one who destroyed this family," Sean replied. "You're the one who walked away." Eric switched tactics. "You don't understand," he said. "I was unhappy. I was suffocating. Do you know how hard it was to stay in that house, day after day, pretending everything was fine?" "Maybe it was hard," Sean shot back. "But that doesn't excuse what you did." Eric had no response to that, so he tried a new angle: religion. He started quoting scripture, invoking parables about forgiveness and redemption. "Even the prodigal son was welcomed back," he said. "But you're not the prodigal son," Sean said, cutting him off. "You're the one who left and blamed everyone else for it. That's not redemption. It's just selfishness." His religious appeals became a recurring theme. In texts and voicemails, he'd quote Bible verses about forgiveness, painting himself as a repentant sinner seeking absolution. But his words rang hollow. "God forgives those who truly repent," he said in one voicemail. "And I've been doing a lot of soul searching. I know I've made mistakes, but I deserve a second chance." Claire, overhearing the message, rolled her eyes. "Funny how he never quoted scripture when he was sneaking off to see Laura," she muttered. It didn't matter what angle he tried, guilt, religion, or pity. None of us were buying it. Eric wasn't seeking redemption. He was seeking control. He wanted to rewrite the story, to make himself the victim instead of the villain. For a while, I wondered if I should meet with him, if only to say everything I'd been holding in since this whole mess began. But every time I thought about it, I remembered the cold, unapologetic look on his face when he told Claire, "I haven't loved you in years." I remembered how he dismissed Mark's pain, stolen from Claire, and justified it all as his right. Eric had already shown us who he was. Meeting with him wouldn't change anything. It would only give him another chance to twist the knife. The calls eventually slowed, then stopped altogether. Maybe he realized we weren't going to play along. Or maybe he just moved on to another target. Either way, we were done. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Eric's manipulation no longer had a hold on us. He was still out there, spiraling in his own mess, but we weren't part of it anymore. It had been months since any of us had seen Eric in person. By then, Claire was officially divorced, the paperwork finalized with little fanfare. For her, it was less of a celebration and more of a quiet relief. Proof that she was free from Eric's shadow. My brothers and I had also started to move on. though the scars of his betrayal lingered in ways none of us fully understood. One sunny Saturday afternoon, Claire decided to host a family barbecue at her place. It was the first time in years that all of us, me, Mark, Sean, Ben, and even their growing families, were together. There was laughter, the smell of grilling burgers, and the sound of kids running through the yard. For a few hours, it felt like things were normal again. And then Eric showed up. I didn't see him at first. I was at the grill, flipping burgers and talking to Sean about work when the energy in the yard shifted. Conversations quieted, and a few heads turned toward the driveway. I looked up and felt my stomach drop. There he was, standing at the edge of the yard with a strained smile, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He looked older, thinner, and somehow smaller than I remembered, but his presence still carried the same weight it always had. Mark was the first to approach him. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and tense as he stepped in front of Eric. Eric's smile faltered. "I heard you were all getting together," he said. "I just wanted to see my family." Mark didn't move. "You're not welcome here. I'm still your father," Eric said, his voice trembling. "I deserve to be here." It wasn't a statement. It was a plea. But before Mark could respond, Claire's voice cut through the tension. "No," she said firmly, stepping forward. "You don't." Claire's tone left no room for argument. She stood tall, her gaze steady as she addressed Eric. "You made your choice, Eric. You chose to leave this family, to betray us, and to destroy everything we built. You don't get to show up now and act like none of that happened." Eric looked taken aback, like he hadn't expected her to confront him so directly. "I'm trying to make things right," he said weakly. "You don't make things right by showing up uninvited," Claire shot back. "You make things right by taking responsibility for what you've done, and you've never done that." For a moment, Eric didn't say anything. He just stood there, shifting uncomfortably under Claire's gaze. Then he turned his attention to us, me, Sean, Ben, and Mark, his voice desperate. "I know I've made mistakes," he said, "but I'm still your father. Doesn't that count for something?" Mark crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "It counted," he said. "But you burned that bridge, Dad. You burned it when you lied to us, when you stole from us, and when you blamed us for your mistakes." Eric's face crumpled. "I was unhappy," he said. "I didn't know what else to do. And now neither do we," Mark said, his voice cold. The silence that followed was deafening. Eric looked around the yard, his eyes lingering on each of us, as if waiting for someone to step forward to offer him a lifeline. But no one did. Eventually, he sighed and turned back to Claire. "I just wanted to see my family," he said quietly. "This isn't your family anymore," she replied, her voice steady but not unkind. "You made sure of that." With that, Eric nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked back to his car. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of anger, sadness, and relief. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to say something, anything, to fill the void he'd left behind. But another part of me knew there was nothing left to say. As the sound of his car faded into the distance, the tension in the yard began to lift. Conversations resumed, though there was an unspoken understanding that things wouldn't fully return to normal for the rest of the day. Claire walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Eric had tried to reconcile, but it wasn't reconciliation he was after. He didn't want to fix what he'd broken. He just wanted to feel like he hadn't lost everything. But he had, and for the first time, I realized that wasn't our burden to carry anymore. After the failed attempt at reconciliation, Eric spiraled further, sinking deeper into a pit of self-destruction. It wasn't long before mutual acquaintances began reaching out with stories about his increasingly erratic behavior. "I saw your dad at O'Malley's the other night," an old family friend texted me. "He was not doing great." O'Malley's was a dingy dive bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place you ended up when you were trying to forget your problems. Apparently, Eric had become a regular. The first time I heard about him showing up there, I felt a pang of pity. Despite everything, he was still my dad. But the more I learned, the harder it became to feel sorry for him. He wasn't just drinking, he was ranting. To anyone who would listen, he painted himself as the victim, the wronged man abandoned by an ungrateful family. One night, an acquaintance ran into him and overheard one of his tirades. "My ex-wife turned my kids against me," Eric slurred, waving a half-empty glass. "I gave them everything, everything. And how did they repay me? They cut me out like I'm nothing." When the acquaintance relayed the story to me, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Gave us everything?" I said aloud, shaking my head. "He took everything." Eric's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Between the divorce settlement, legal fees, and the loss of his job, he burned through what little money he had left in record time. Laura's departure had only made things worse. Without her to prop up his ego, Eric was left to face the wreckage of his life alone. But instead of taking responsibility, he doubled down on his delusions. He refused to sell his house, even though he could no longer afford the mortgage, and spent what little cash he had on alcohol and nights out. More than once, I heard from acquaintances who'd seen him trying to start arguments with bartenders or getting thrown out of establishments for being belligerent. "Your dad's not doing well," one of them said to me during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "I figured," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "You don't think you should, I don't know, help him?" I bit back the urge to snap. Help him? How do you help someone who doesn't think they've done anything wrong? Instead, I just said, he made his choices. Now he's living with them. In Eric's mind, though, none of this was his fault. He saw himself as the victim of an unjust world, the target of a conspiracy orchestrated by Claire and us. He left me a voicemail one night, his words slurred and barely coherent. Nate, you have to understand. I didn't mean for things to get like this. But your mother, Claire, she poisoned you boys against me. She's the reason we're like this. Not me." I didn't call him back. A few weeks later, he showed up at Sean's workplace, causing a scene. Sean, who had tried harder than any of us to maintain some semblance of a relationship with Eric, finally reached his breaking point. "You don't get to walk in here and disrupt my life," Sean told him, his voice low but firm. "I'm your father," Eric yelled, drawing the attention of Sean's co-workers. "You owe me respect." Sean crossed his arms. "Respect is earned. And you lost mine a long time ago." The stories kept piling up. Eric, drunk and rambling at a karaoke night. Eric trying to borrow money from an old church friend. Eric passed out in his car in the parking lot of a liquor store. Each new tale was like a punch to the gut, but not for the reasons he probably hoped. I wasn't sad for him. I was angry. Angry that he still refused to take responsibility. Angry that he was dragging our name through the mud. Angry that the man who had once demanded so much from us couldn't muster the courage to fix his own mistakes. The last straw came when he tried to guilt-trip Claire through a mutual acquaintance. "He's struggling," the acquaintance said, her tone dripping with concern. "Don't you think you should reach out? He's still the father of your children." Claire didn't even hesitate. "He stopped being my husband the moment he betrayed me. And as for being their father, that's up to them, not me." I admired her strength, but it didn't make the situation any easier. Watching Eric spiral was like watching a slow-motion car crash. You knew how it would end, but you couldn't look away. And through it all, one thing remained clear. Eric wasn't going to change. He didn't want redemption. He wanted someone else to carry the weight of his mistakes. But we were done being his crutch. He'd made his bed. Now he had to lie in it. Moving on from Eric wasn't as simple as cutting him out of our lives. The damage he caused didn't disappear just because he did. His betrayal left a scar on our family, one that sometimes felt like it would never fully heal. Claire, ever the resilient matriarch, threw herself into rebuilding her life. After the divorce was finalized, she sold the house she'd shared with Eric and moved into a smaller, cozier place closer to Sean and his family. The new house, with its bright walls and open windows, was the opposite of the dark, heavy atmosphere Eric had cultivated for years. She filled her days with hobbies she'd never had time for before: gardening, baking, and doting on her grandchildren. My brothers and I often joked that she was turning into a Pinterest mom in her retirement years. But the truth was, we admired her ability to find joy again. "It's not always easy," she admitted one evening when we were all gathered in her living room. "There are days I still hear his voice in my head, telling me I'm not enough, that I'm too soft. But then I look at all of you, at what we've survived, and I remind myself that I am enough. I always was." For my brothers and me, moving forward meant confronting the ways Eric's actions had shaped us. We'd all grown up under his rigid, authoritarian rule, and while we were free from it now, the effects lingered in ways we didn't always recognize. Mark, who'd always been the most pragmatic of us, became hyper-focused on financial independence. After Eric's betrayal, he refused to rely on anyone else, even when it might have made his life easier. He and Dana worked tirelessly to pay off their mortgage early, and he was always prepared for the worst-case scenario. "I'm not going to let what happened to Claire happen to us," he told me once. "I won't give anyone the power to pull the rug out from under my family." Sean, on the other hand, became almost obsessive about transparency in his relationships. He and his wife, Emma, had weekly check-ins to talk about their feelings, goals, and any potential issues. At first, it seemed excessive, but after everything we'd been through, it made sense. Sean needed to know that he would never wake up one day to find his world had been a lie. As for me, I struggled with trust. Whether it was in friendships, romantic relationships, or even professional settings, I found myself second-guessing people's motives. Every time someone got too close, I'd hear Eric's voice in the back of my head. You never really know someone. Eric's betrayal hardened us in ways we didn't expect. We became more guarded, more skeptical of people's intentions. And while we'd banded together as a family, there was an unspoken weight that hung over us during every gathering, every shared meal. Even the grandchildren, innocent as they were, weren't entirely spared from Eric's shadow. They asked questions sometimes, especially Mark's oldest, who was starting to notice the absence of a grandfather figure. "Why doesn't Grandpa Eric come to our house?" she asked one afternoon while helping Claire in the garden. Claire paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Because Grandpa Eric made some choices that hurt our family," she said carefully. "Doesn't he love us anymore?" the little girl asked, her brow furrowed. Claire knelt down, taking her granddaughter's tiny hands in hers. "It's not about love," she said softly. "Sometimes people make mistakes so big that they don't know how to fix them. And when that happens, it's okay to protect yourself." Despite the pain Eric left behind, we found solace in one another. My brothers and I grew closer than we'd ever been, bound by our shared experiences and our determination to break the cycle of toxicity Eric had perpetuated. We made a pact, unspoken but understood, to be better, to be the kinds of fathers, husbands, and brothers that Eric never was. We supported each other through tough times, celebrated each other's successes, and made sure to show up for the little things like birthday parties and soccer games. But even as we moved forward, Eric's shadow loomed large. His betrayal had changed us, shaped us in ways we couldn't undo. And while we'd learned to live with the scars, there were moments, quiet, unexpected moments, when the pain resurfaced. A song on the radio, a passing comment from a stranger, or the sight of an older man walking hand in hand with his grandson. These were the things that brought Eric back, not as the man he was, but as the ghost of what he should have been. For better or worse, he would always be a part of our story. But we were determined to make sure he wasn't the end of it. Last week, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was almost midnight, and I frowned at the unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Against my better judgment, I picked up, figuring it might be important. "Hello." There was a pause, followed by the unmistakable sound of Eric's voice, slurred and heavy. "Nate," he said, dragging out the syllables. "It's me, your dad." I froze. It had been months since I'd heard from him. He'd stopped calling regularly after his last attempt at reconciliation failed, and honestly, I thought he'd given up. But here he was, invading my peace once again. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," he mumbled, his words thick with alcohol. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Sorry for what, Dad?" I asked, my voice flat. Another pause. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer, that he might finally take responsibility for the wreckage he'd left in his wake. But the line stayed silent, save for the faint sound of his labored breathing. "You don't even know, do you?" I said finally, my frustration boiling over. "You've said and done so much damage. You can't even pinpoint what you're apologizing for." "I know I messed up," he said, his voice cracking. "I know I hurt you boys. I don't know how to fix it." His words hung in the air, but instead of sympathy, I felt a familiar anger bubbling to the surface. This wasn't the first time Eric had tried to paint himself as the lost, regretful man who didn't know where he'd gone wrong. And yet, every time he'd had the opportunity to fix things, to show real remorse, he'd squandered it. "You can't fix it, Dad," I said, my tone colder than I intended. "You made your choices. You knew what you were doing, and you did it anyway. You didn't just hurt us. You destroyed us." "I didn't mean to," he said, his voice trembling. "But you did," I snapped. "And now you want what? Forgiveness? Closure?" "I don't have that to give you." There was a long pause, and I could hear him struggling to find the right words. "I just miss you boys," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Something in me broke. "You miss us?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You miss us now? After everything?" "You don't miss us, Dad. You miss the version of your life where we respected you, where you could pretend you were the hero. But that's gone. You burned it down, and now you're standing in the ashes wondering why no one's there to help you." Eric didn't respond. For a brief moment, I thought he might have hung up, but then I heard him let out a shaky breath, the kind that comes right before tears. "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve anything from you boys. But I'm so lonely, Nate. I don't know what to do anymore. His voice cracked on the last word, and for a fleeting second, I felt a pang of pity. Despite everything, he was still my father. A small part of me wanted to believe that he could change, that he could be the man we needed him to be all along. But then I remembered the years of lies, manipulation, and selfishness. I remembered the way he'd looked Claire in the eye and told her he hadn't loved her in years, the way he'd stolen from us and justified it as his right. "I'm sorry you're lonely," I said finally. "But that's not my responsibility." There was another long pause, and then the line went dead. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, my heart heavy with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Anger, sadness, relief. That night, I didn't sleep well. Eric's words replayed in my mind, along with memories of the man he used to be, or maybe the man I'd imagined he was. I wondered if this was the last time I'd hear from him, if he'd finally give up and let us move on. But deep down, I knew Eric too well. He wouldn't let go so easily. He'd keep calling, keep reaching out, clinging to the hope that one of us would throw him a lifeline. And yet, as much as it hurt to shut him out, I knew it was the only way to protect myself. Eric wanted forgiveness, but what he really needed was accountability. And until he found that within himself, there was nothing I or anyone else could do for him. I don't know what the future holds for Eric or for us. There are days when I think about him and wonder if he'll ever truly understand the damage he's done, if he'll ever wake up and see the wreckage he left behind. But those thoughts are fleeting. I've learned not to dwell on them. Some wounds don't heal, not completely. They scab over, they fade, but they never disappear. Eric's betrayal cut deep, and while we've managed to rebuild our lives in his absence, there's a part of me that knows a shadow will always be there, lingering on the edges. Still, we're moving forward. Claire has found a new sense of purpose in her life, surrounding herself with the love and support she always deserved but never received from Eric. She's taken up painting, something she'd always wanted to do but never had time for. And her house is filled with vibrant landscapes and portraits that reflect the warmth she brings to everyone around her. My brothers and I have found our own ways to cope. Mark is thriving as the rock of his family, determined to give his kids the stability we never had growing up. Sean has become the glue that holds us all together, always the first to suggest a family dinner or a weekend hike. Ben, the youngest, is still finding his footing, but he's learning to trust himself and the people around him, a skill Eric never taught us. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. There are moments when I catch myself thinking about Eric, wondering if he's still sitting in some dingy bar, blaming the world for his failures. Part of me wants to reach out, to see if he's changed, but the larger part knows better. Forgiveness doesn't mean putting myself back in harm's way. I've learned to live with the absence, to accept that some questions will never have answers. Why'd he do it? Did he ever really love us? Was he always this selfish, or did something break him along the way? These thoughts pop up from time to time, but they no longer consume me. The truth is, Eric made his choice, and so did we. We chose to protect ourselves, to build something new out of the ashes of what he destroyed. And while it's not perfect, it's enough. I'll probably never know if Eric finds redemption, or if he even understands the concept. Maybe he'll spend the rest of his life chasing something he'll never have, a family that forgives him, a legacy that isn't tarnished. Or maybe he'll disappear entirely, fading into the background of our lives until he's just a name we mention in passing. For now, all I can do is keep moving forward. The future is uncertain, but it's ours to shape, free from the weight of Eric's hypocrisy and selfishness.